If your childhood plate ever featured something suspiciously green, suspiciously jiggly, or suspiciously covered in fried onions, this video's for you. Let's take a seat at the table and remember the southern side dishes that shaped us, scarred us, and somehow became comfort food. If you grew up in the South, you probably remember that big pot on the stove, bubbling away like some kind of witch's brew, collard greens, and a ham hock, with a ladle of bacon grease for good measure. Mom swore you had to wash the greens 3 times, or you'd end up with a mouthful of grit. Most days, she'd buy them in a plastic bag from Piggly Wiggly, but if she was feeling ambitious, she'd get them fresh and make me help tear the leaves. I can't say I loved collards as a kid, but I ate them anyway, mostly because Mom said they'd put hair on your chest. I'm still waiting. The trick was to drown them in pepper vinegar and chase every bite with cornbread. If you've never seen a salad with more mayonnaise than lettuce, you didn't grow up in the South. 7-layer salad was the kind of thing that showed up at every church potluck, right next to the Jell-O mold and the bowl of punch with floating sherbet. Mom started with iceberg lettuce, always iceberg, never anything fancy. Then frozen peas, chopped onions, hard-boiled eggs, shredded cheddar, and bacon bits. The crowning achievement was a thick layer of mayonnaise, spread on top like she was frosting a cake. It looked impressive in that glass bowl, but let's be honest, by the time you dug through all those layers, you were just looking for the bacon. These days, I find myself making it for potlucks, and I finally get what all the fuss was about, especially that salty, sweet mayo layer. If you ever wondered what to do with the rest of that can of peas after making 7-layer salad, here's your answer. She'd dump a can of peas into a Tupperware bowl, toss in some cubes of cheddar, a handful of diced celery. Then, the first bite was always a shock. Sweet, tangy, and a little squeaky between your teeth. As a kid, you'd push it around your plate. As an adult, you realize it's actually kind of good. Spinach cheese squares were Mom's idea of sneaking in greens. She'd grab a box of frozen chopped spinach, usually bird's eye, always on sale, squeeze out the water like she was mad at it. The result baked up into these soft, cheesy squares that looked a little like something you'd win at the school cakewalk, but tasted way better. They were best straight from the pan, still warm, and if you waited too long, Dad would eat the last one and claim he was just making sure they didn't go to waste. Tomato aspic was a gelatinous horror that lurked at every holiday table, and the dish that haunted my childhood. Let's just call this what it was. Tomato Jell-O. It wobbled, it glistened, it tasted like someone lost a bet. Mom would open a can of Campbell's tomato juice, sprinkle in Knox gelatin, and add celery and onions like she was making a salad for someone she didn't like very much. She'd pour it into her copper Jell-O mold, the one shaped like a wreath, and let it chill until it jiggled like a nervous chihuahua. When it hit the table, you knew you were in for it. The taste? Imagine a V8 that's been left in the fridge too long and decided to get ideas above its station. I'd take a polite slice while trying not to make eye contact, drown it in salt, and try to hide my grimace. But you ate it, because Mom said it was refreshing. And in those days, you didn't argue with Mom's idea of refreshment. To this day, I still avoid anything that jiggles and tastes like vegetables. Some things you never outgrow. Green bean casserole was the only way most of us kids willingly ate vegetables. Mom would dump 2 cans of Del Monte green beans into her blue-flowered Corningware, stir in Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, maybe some secret spices, and top it with a mountain of French's fried onions. She'd bake it until the edges bubbled and the onions got that perfect greasy crunch. I'd always try to pick off the onions and munch them down before anyone noticed, but Mom had eyes in the back of her head. The beans themselves were just a vehicle for the crispy topping. Let's be honest, none of us kids were there for the vegetables. If you got a scoop with extra onions, you knew it was your lucky day. Baked acorn squash was Mom's idea of something different. She'd pick out the prettiest one at Winn-Dixie, slice it in half with her biggest knife, and scoop out the seeds with a grapefruit spoon. Then came the pat of bluebonnet margarine and a mountain of Domino brown sugar. She'd roast it until the kitchen smelled like October and the edges caramelized just right. I'd scoop out the soft, sweet flesh and pretend I liked it as much as mashed potatoes. Truth was, it was pretty good, especially if you got the half with the most brown sugar. You'd know Mom was cleaning out the fridge when she pulled out that Tupperware of cold mashed potatoes, or, if we were lucky, a couple of baked spuds from the night before. She'd peel and grate them by hand. No fancy food processor, just the old metal box grater that always threatened to take a little skin with it. Into a mixing bowl they'd go, joined by a handful of chopped yellow onion, a scoop of gold medal flour, and an egg or two to hold it all together. Sometimes she'd toss in a pinch of Lorry's or a dusting of dried parsley if she was feeling gourmet. Mom would heat up a heavy skillet, usually the cast iron one that never left the stovetop, and pour in a generous slick of Wesson oil. She'd drop the potato mixture in by the spoonful, flattening each mound with the back of her spatula until it sizzled and popped like a 4th of July sparkler. The kitchen would fill with the smell of onions caramelizing and potatoes crisping. A scent so comforting it could make you forget you were eating leftovers. If Dad caught wind, he'd wander in with a fork, claiming he was just checking on supper. By the time the rest of the family sat down, the stack was already suspiciously low. Mom always served them with a dollop of Breakstone's sour cream, or, if we were feeling fancy, a spoonful of Mott's applesauce, sometimes both. The edges were so crispy they'd shatter, while the inside stayed soft and pillowy, flecked with bits of golden onion. You could eat a dozen before you realized you were full, and then eat 2 more just because. If there was ever a dish that could turn a regular Tuesday into a holiday, it was Mom's baked macaroni and cheese. And I'm not talking about that blue box Kraft stuff with the neon dust. No, this was the real deal. Elbow macaroni from the A&P, boiled in a pot, big enough to bathe a toddler, then drained and dumped into a battered Pyrex that had seen more casseroles than a church potluck. Mom would layer the macaroni with sharp cheddar, Colby Jack, and, if we were lucky, a little Velveeta for that creamy, melt-in-your-mouth magic, and butter, salt, and pepper. Then, like she was some kind of mad scientist, she'd whisk up a couple of eggs, a splash of whole milk, some folks added carnation, and a suspiciously generous pinch of white pepper. Sometimes she'd throw in a dollop of daisy sour cream for richness and more butter because, well, it was the 70s and nobody was counting calories. Then pour this heart attack mixture over the mound of cheese and macaroni with the kind of focus usually reserved for bomb squads. Then top it off with another avalanche of cheese. Into the oven it went, and the smell would drift through the house, making it impossible to wait for dinner. I'd hover by the oven door, watching the top bubble and brown, praying Mom would let me snag the first scoop. The best part? That crispy, golden edge where the cheese met the pan or bowl and turned into pure, salty crackle. You'd fight for it like it was the last piece of Halloween candy. Fried okra was the South's answer to popcorn, only better and more likely to get stuck in your teeth. Mom would slice up a mess of okra from the garden if it was summer, or buy it by the bag at Piggly Wiggly. She'd toss it in Martha White cornmeal and fry it in her black cast iron skillet with a splash of Crisco. You'd pop them in your mouth by the handful, pretending they counted as a vegetable and feeling virtuous. If you didn't like okra, you just hadn't had it fried by a Southern mom with a heavy hand on the salt shaker. Now, I order fried okra at every meat and 3 and still judge a restaurant by how well they do it. Hush puppies were the little golden hush money that made every fish fry feel special. Mom would haul out her big yellow mixing bowl and start with a scoop of white lily cornmeal and a handful of all-purpose flour. She'd toss in a spoonful of sugar, a pinch of baking powder, and a little salt. Then came the buttermilk, an egg, and always some grated yellow onion, enough to make your eyes sting and your mouth water at the same time. If she was feeling fancy, she'd add a dash of cayenne or a sprinkle of parsley, but most days it was just the basics. The sizzle when that first spoonful hit the hot oil was like applause at the end of a long day. I was always on quality control duty, which meant I got to sneak the first one, still too hot to handle, and blow on it until steam curled up my nose. The outside would crunch, the inside would steam, and the onion would come through just enough to make you want another. Sometimes Mom would serve them with tartar sauce or a little honey, but most of the time, we just ate them straight, burning our fingers and grinning like we'd gotten away with something. Legend has it, they were tossed to barking dogs to keep them quiet during cookouts. I can't say if that's true, but they sure worked on us kids. Corn pudding was what happened when Mom decided corn deserved better than just being on the cob. She'd mix up a can of green giant cream corn, a helping of cornstarch, eggs, a splash of pet milk, and more butter than the recipe ever asked for. Baked until the top was golden and the inside was soft and custardy. And you go back for seconds, even if you were already full. If you think onions are just for burgers, you never had Mom's baked onions. She'd slice up a couple of Vidalias, layer them in her Pyrex, dot them with Land O'Lakes butter, and rain down a blizzard of Kraft Parmesan. The cheese bubbled and browned in spots, creating little crispy patches that were worth fighting over. As a kid, I'd wrinkle my nose at the smell and complain about the onion breath it promised, but I'd always end up sneaking seconds when no one was looking. Leather britches weren't something you found at the Piggly Wiggly or even in the back of the A&P freezer case. No, these were pure Appalachian ingenuity, a way to make sure green beans lasted long after the garden quit giving. Every summer, Mom would haul in a basket of beans. She'd poke that needle right through the middle of each bean, stringing them up like garlands for a harvest festival, except these hung from the rafters. The beans would dangle there for weeks, drying out in the attic or sometimes above the wood stove if it was a rainy stretch. By fall, they'd gone from plump and green to shriveled and leathery, looking more like something you'd find in a pioneer's saddlebag than on a supper table. If you brushed past them, they'd rattle like old bones. Cooking them was a whole other ritual. Mom would snip them off the string, give them a good soak, because, let's be honest, attic beans needed a bath, and then simmer them for hours with a hunk of salt pork or a slab of bacon. The smell would fill the house, smoky, earthy, and somehow both ancient and comforting. The finished dish was nothing like the bright, squeaky green beans from a can. These were chewy, smoky, and packed with flavor. I might not string beans on a thread anymore, but I'd give anything for one more bowl. Slow-cooked and smoky, just like Mom used to make. Scalloped potatoes were the side dish you'd risk a fork fight for. Mom would slice up russets paper thin, layer them with onions and handfuls of different kinds of shredded cheese, then drown the whole thing in chicken broth, half and half, and different spices. Maybe a dash of dry mustard if she was feeling adventurous. Into the oven it went, and out came a bubbling golden pan that could make even meatloaf night feel special. And of course, scalloped potatoes weren't finished until they were sprinkled with the all-important chives. You haven't had butter beans until you've had southern butter beans. Butter beans are known for their creamy texture and mild, buttery flavor. Butter beans is largely a southern term, and more often than not, you'll find them labeled as large lima beans at the store. You knew you were in for a treat when Mom pulled out those large, dried lima beans. But the large variety really is pretty stunning, and you get more of that buttery flesh. Whatever the case, she never used canned beans. That was a culinary crime when it came to butter beans. The beans were creamy, the ham was salty, and the broth was so good you'd sop it up with either cornbread muffins or skillet cornbread. You could feel them butter beans in your bones, not just taste them on your lips. They might not have seemed like such a big deal when we were kids, but now they might just be the ultimate southern comfort dish, so warm and buttery and inviting. Marinated cucumbers and onions were a fixture in our fridge every summer, usually in a big Tupperware bowl with a lid that never quite sealed. You'd open the fridge and get a whiff of vinegar so sharp it could clear your sinuses and make you blink twice. Mom would start with cucumbers, whatever was cheapest at Kroger, or, if we were lucky, The knobby ones from the backyard garden. She'd slice them thin, sometimes with that old metal mandolin that threatened to take a fingertip off if you weren't careful. Then came the onions. Sweet vidalias if they were in season, or just plain yellow if they weren't. Sometimes she'd toss in a clove of garlic or a few peppercorns, but most days it was just the basics. She'd pour it over the cucumbers and onions, give everything a good toss, and let it chill in the fridge for at least an hour, though the longer it sat, the better it got. It was the side dish that went with everything. Barbecue, fried chicken, or just a tomato sandwich on a hot day. The cucumbers stayed crisp, the onions mellowed out, and the whole thing was cold, tangy, and just sweet enough to keep you coming back for more. I'd always try to fish out the cucumbers and leave the onions for someone else, but Mom had a way of noticing when the ratio got suspicious. As a kid, I thought of it as pickle salad, refreshing, crunchy, and a little bit sneaky. It was the only green thing I'd eat without a fight, especially when the rest of the plate was loaded with fried food. Rice and gravy was the glue that held every Southern supper together. Humble, hearty, and guaranteed to fill you up, even if payday was still a week away. In our house, it started with a cheap cut of beef from the Piggly Wiggly meat counter, usually chuck roast or sirloin tips, whatever was on sale, and had enough fat to promise flavor. Mom would cut the meat into chunks and season it with salt, pepper, and a little Tony Chachere's if she was feeling Cajun that day. She'd heat up her big Dutch oven, the one with the chipped enamel and the wobbly lid, and sear the beef until it was brown enough to set off the smoke alarm. Then came the Holy Trinity: onions, bell pepper, and celery, chopped fine and tossed into the pot with a sizzle that meant business. She let the meat cook low and slow, adding beef broth or water a little at a time, scraping up all those dark, sticky bits from the bottom of the pot. The good stuff. The gravy would thicken, darken, and fill the whole house with a smell that could make the dogs start drooling under the table. While the gravy simmered, she'd cook up a pot of Uncle Ben's rice. Never instant, always long grain, because we're not animals. These days, I make rice and gravy when I need comfort food that tastes like home. If there was a single dish that could bring the whole family to the kitchen like moths to a porch light, it was deviled eggs. Mom made them for every occasion: Easter, Thanksgiving, church picnics, and even the occasional Tuesday night when she was feeling generous. She'd start with a dozen eggs from the Piggly Wiggly, boiled just right. Peeling those eggs was a family sport. Sometimes the shells slipped off easy, but more often than not, you'd end up with pockmarked whites that looked like they'd survived a hailstorm. Didn't matter. Once they were sliced in half and the yolks scooped out, nobody was judging. The filling was where the real magic happened. Mom would mash the yolks with a fork, then add a big spoonful of Duke's mayo, a squirt of French's yellow mustard, and, if you were in a true Southern household, a good scoop of sweet pickle relish, or even a little dill relish for a tangy kick. If she was in a hurry, she'd spoon the filling back in. But if company was coming, she'd pipe it with a plastic bag snipped at the corner, making little yellow swirls that looked almost too pretty to eat. Almost. The final touch was always a dusting of paprika. The tray would hit the table and vanish faster than you could say, "Save me one." If you hesitated, you went without. Now, as an adult, I make a double batch for every get-together, and I'm still amazed how quickly they disappear. Sweet potato casserole with marshmallows was the great masquerader of the Southern holiday table. Technically a side dish, but everyone knew it was dessert in disguise. Mom would open a can of Bruce's yams, or, if she was feeling ambitious, roast a few sweet potatoes from the farmer's market until the kitchen smelled like autumn. She'd mash them with Domino brown sugar, a glug of vanilla, a pinch of cinnamon, and a scandalous amount of blue bonnet margarine. The whole mixture went into her favorite Pyrex, smoothed out with the back of a wooden spoon, ready for its crowning glory. And that glory was a mountain of jet-puffed marshmallows. Sometimes the big ones, sometimes a snowy drift of minis, scattered over the top until you could barely see a hint of orange underneath. The first spoonful was always a sticky, gooey mess. caramelized sugar on top, creamy sweet potato underneath, and the kind of flavor that made you forget there was turkey on the table. Cornbread dressing wasn't just a side dish at our house. It was a sacred ritual, a family legacy, and a battleground all rolled into one. The process started days before Thanksgiving or other special occasion, when Mom would bake up a big skillet of cornbread. Always from scratch and never ever sweet. Lord help you if you showed up with cornbread made with Jiffy. That little blue box was fine for weeknight chili, but on holidays it was practically a sin. Mom would crumble the cornbread into a giant mixing bowl, add a few slices of stale white bread from the sunbeam loaf, and let it all dry out overnight on the counter, covered with a dish towel that somehow kept out everything but the family cat. The next morning, she'd saute a mess of chopped celery and onions in a stick of butter until the kitchen smelled like Thanksgiving itself. Then came the Swanson chicken broth, poured in a little at a time, until the mixture was just wet enough to hold together, but not so soggy that it turned to mush. Baked in the same battered roasting pan every year, the dressing would come out golden on top and steamy in the middle, ready to soak up a river of gravy. Cabbage with bacon was the dish that could turn even the most stubborn vegetable skeptic into a believer. Mom would haul a head of cabbage out of the crisper drawer, usually with a few bruises from rolling around under the apples, and whack it into thick wedges with her biggest knife. She'd fry up a few strips of Oscar Mayer bacon in her cast iron skillet, letting them sizzle until the kitchen filled with the smell of pure, smoky promise. The bacon came out to drain on a paper towel. Mom would stir and toss, scraping up every bit of flavor from the bottom of the skillet, then crumble the bacon back in and add a splash of Heinz apple cider vinegar for a little tang. Sometimes, she'd toss in a pinch of sugar or a shake of black pepper, but mostly, she let the cabbage and bacon do the talking. As a kid, I'd pretend I didn't like cabbage, but I'd always go back for seconds when nobody was looking, especially if I could snag an extra piece of bacon. Pickled beets were the wild card on the southern table, bright magenta, tangy sweet, and unapologetically staining everything in their path. Mom would either buy the Del Monte cans from Kroger, or if she was feeling ambitious, she'd make her own. That meant boiling a pot full of beets until the kitchen smelled earthy and sweet, hands turning pink as she slipped off the skins under cold running water and slicing them into thick ruby rounds. The magic was in the brine, white or apple cider vinegar, a scoop of Domino sugar, and a handful of whole cloves and allspice simmered together until the kitchen filled with a spicy, tangy perfume. The beets would soak up that brine, then get packed into old glass jars. They stained your fingers and your memory, and you'd eat them because they were there. Cheese grits were the southern answer to, well, just about everything. Mom would start by boiling up water, or, if she was feeling flush, chicken broth in her battered saucepan. She'd whisk in a scoop of Quaker or Bob's Red Mill grits and let them burble away on the stove, low and slow. I'd stand on a chair, peeking over the edge of the pot, watching as she added a pat or two of Land O'Lakes butter, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a splash of heavy cream for good measure. Then came the cheese, a mountain of sharp cheddar, sometimes with a handful of Monterey Jack, or even a little pepper jack if she was feeling spicy. Mom would spoon them into big bowls, sometimes garnishing with a sprinkle of green onions or an extra pat of butter, and we'd eat them with everything from fried chicken to shrimp to nothing at all. Green bean and tomato skillet was the side dish that showed up when the garden was threatening to take over the kitchen. She'd start with a mess of fresh green beans if it was summer, snapping the ends off at the kitchen table while catching up on neighborhood gossip. Into the skillet they'd go, joined by a big, sweet Vidalia onion. Then came the tomatoes. Mom would dump them in, sprinkle in a spoonful of Domino brown sugar for sweetness, a dash of garlic powder, and a good shake of black pepper. As a kid, I'd pick out the bacon first, then the tomatoes, and finally the beans. always saving the best for last. If you made it this far, you've got a true Southern stomach and probably a few stories of your own. If you laughed, cringed, or remembered hiding something under your napkin, hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us which side dish you secretly loved or hated. Because in the South, the stories are just as important as the food, and sometimes a little bit juicier.